Hey, so welcome everyone to the Mountain West Cancer Collaborative webinar series. We are on our third webinar session and are really excited to have you all here. Today we'll be talking about cancer research advocacy. We here at Huntsman Cancer Institute are the designated comprehensive cancer center for Utah, Nevada, Montana, and Wyoming. Jill, can you go to the next slide, please? Our objectives for today's webinar are to be able to provide you with an overview of research advocacy efforts here at Huntsman Cancer Institute, be able to highlight the importance of community and stakeholder involvement in advocacy efforts, and provide you with information on how to get involved in local or national research initiatives. The agenda for today, I am Allison Faust. I am a programs manager here with the Office of Community Outreach and Engagement at Huntsman Cancer Institute, and I work primarily with Nevada, Idaho, and Wyoming. And then Jill Christian, who's also on screen and will be managing our chat and our slides for today, oversees our efforts in Montana. And we have some amazing speakers with us here today. Vincent Pacileo and John Freimuth from the National Cancer Institute. And then we have Carla Lloyd, who's the chair of the Breast and Gynecologic Cancer Research Advocate Committee at Huntsman Cancer Institute. We will have some time for some question and answer after we hear from Vincent and John with the National Cancer Institute. You'll have some time to interact with our presenters, ask what questions you have. And then we also have a few questions to sort of guide them through as well. And then we'll be able to hear from Carla and offer some additional resources at the end of this. For those of you that just joined, feel free to chat in the chat box, put your name, what state you're from, what organization you're from. Would love to hear from you. As I said, feel free to have your cameras on if you have any questions. We want this to be an interactive session, but also no pressure to have your cameras on. We will be sending out a recording to everyone who's in attendance or who registered for this event. Here at Huntsman Cancer Institute, our mission is to be able to understand cancer from its beginnings, use that knowledge in the creation and improvement of cancer treatments, relieve the suffering of cancer patients, and provide education about cancer risk, prevention, and treatment. Our vision is passionate individuals and teams delivering a cancer-free frontier through scientific discovery and human touch. You'll hear us use the phrase, the area we serve, a lot for those of you that work with many of us here at Huntsman Cancer Institute and the Office of Community Outreach Engagement. But essentially what we mean by the areas we serve is that we as a cancer center have a formalized catchment area. And this means that we have a geographic area that we serve through research, clinical trials, community outreach, and engagement. Huntsman Cancer Institute increased the work happening in this region and formalized our commitment to these 5 states in 2021: Idaho, Montana, Nevada, Utah, and Wyoming. We also have a clinical affiliate network. A clinical affiliate is where we are able to provide cancer treatment centers with our resources, access to our cancer experts, expedited care for patients that are requiring treatment, and the ability to treat patients closer to home in rural communities. And so you'll see here that we have at least 1 clinical affiliate in each of these 5 states, 2 in Wyoming, and we're able to offer them support through helping them design their clinics, helping them start up with training, physician assistance, patient education, helping assist with clinical trial infrastructure and supports, sharing with patient care coordination between sites in those rural areas and Huntsman Cancer Institute. And services range for each of these sites, but they can include genetic counseling and clinical trials as well. Now, I mentioned that I work with the Office of Community Outreach and Engagement. This team has grown a lot in the last year, and so we are now an office who is able to work in these 5 states, and we are the conveners of the Mountain West Cancer Collaborative. We're able to work with comprehensive cancer control programs, cancer coalitions, health systems, and community organizations to help build awareness and education on cancer risk factors, prevention, screening, treatment, and enrollment in clinical trials. Now, the Mountain West Cancer Collaborative, I wanted to highlight a few things that this collaborative is and that this collaborative is not. This collaborative really is designed to be a space where we can foster bidirectional learning, resource sharing, relationship building, and collaboration across state lines and tribal communities. We are able to do this through a series of monthly newsletters and quarterly webinars, and several ad hoc working groups to move this work forward. However, this is not a formal coalition. We will not have our own strategic plan. We want to really help support the cancer coalitions that exist in all of these 5 states. And so this is a very open and collaborative space. There's no sort of official membership. And this is not a decision-making body, but really just designed to be this collaborative space across the 5 states. Now, if you're not already a part of our email list and our newsletter, please take a moment to, you can just hold your phones up, open the camera, and sign up for our newsletter directly from here. This is how you'll hear about future webinars as well. Now, I would like to take a moment to introduce our first speakers. Today, we're going to hear from John Freimuth and Vincent Pacileo. John joined NCI's Office of Advocacy Relations in 2016 as an Advocacy Relations Manager. He works as a liaison between research advocates and NCI's program staff to ensure collective patient perspective is incorporated into NCI's research programs and initiatives. He also advises program staff on the best ways to engage advocates in the research process. In addition, John also supports NCI by communicating priorities and issues within the advocacy community to NCI leadership. Vincent joined NCI's Office of Advocacy Relations in 2021. In this role with OAR, Vincent works to enhance relationships between cancer advocacy organizations and the NCI research enterprise. He also leads engagement activities with the Institute's Council of Research Advocates, the only federal advisory board comprised solely of cancer advocate leaders. Prior to joining NCI, Vincent advanced public policies related to medicine quality and the supply chain at U.S. Pharmaceutical. Previously, he held federal government affairs at the Arthritis Foundation, and earlier in his career held policy and advocacy positions at the Medical Specialty Society Health Policy Think Tank and a global biopharmaceutical company. So I would like to welcome Vincent and John, and feel free to turn on your cameras if you haven't already, and I will turn the time over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Allison, Jill, and Rachel, for really making this connection and welcoming us to this group to share a bit more about the National Cancer Institute, specifically the Office of Advocacy Relations, and how NCI incorporates what we refer to as the collective patient throughout NCI's research enterprise. We really appreciate the opportunity and have been looking forward to it. Again, I've been at OAR at NCI over 8 years now, almost all of which in the advocacy office, and connecting with advocates and other individuals, involved in the fight against cancer is really, without a doubt, one of my favorite parts of the job. So thank you again for this opportunity, and we can go to the next slide, please. Again, just to frame the presentation, I'll be sharing a little bit about the background of NCI, and then a little bit more information about the Office of Advocacy Relations and what we do there to incorporate the advocate perspective. So just to kind of provide a bit of background, NCI is a part of the National Institutes of Health. We are the largest in terms of staffing as well as budget. Our mandate through the National Cancer Act really is research. Everything we do is with an eye for research. We understand that there are many different ways advocates get involved across the community, legislative work, fundraising, research advocacy, patient support. NCI's mandate is research, so that's the way in which we really work with research advocates. We are the largest of NIH's 27 different components, and really, as the leader of the National Cancer Program, our job is to really, there's really 5 main things: to understand the causes of cancer, understand the mechanisms of cancer, improve early detection and diagnosis, develop effective and efficient treatments, and improve cancer control and prevention. Next slide, please. So, making this sustained progress really, we work across the landscape with all different government organizations as well. Again, the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, they do a lot of regulatory work. CMS and CDC do other work in this, in this realm. But we really, our job is to really create a comprehensive national cancer program. And we manage this program with respect to understanding all those things I mentioned. And really, everything we do is to try to advance research that improves patients' lives. Next slide, please. To achieve this, we do research really across the spectrum, from basic science, early detection, diagnosis, clinical trials, all the way through survivorship. We have 30 different divisions, offices, and centers that work together to create that comprehensive cancer research agenda. I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but as a government organization, we do focus heavily in the basic science. But the way in which we carry out all this research is by providing grants to support a host of different research projects, conducting research ourselves in our own laboratories and clinics at the the NIH Clinical Center in Bethesda, Maryland, which is shared by all the NIH institutes, as well as the Frederick National Lab for Cancer Research. We provide training grants, career awards, and fellowships to support education and support. As you guys know as well as anyone, we do support a national network of cancer centers. And we also do a lot of work in our communications office to collect and disseminate information on a variety of issues related to cancer care and research. Next slide, please. So, kind of slicing things, we have 2 main programs. We have our extramural research program, which is roughly 80% of our budget and goes out the door immediately, again, to different grants, contracts. We have a national clinical trials network that focuses on primarily phase 3 precision medicine trials, obviously the comprehensive cancer centers, but really this is all work that is funded by NCI and conducted externally, whether it's community oncology practices, academic centers, or some of those other items I mentioned. Our intramural research program is the other 20% of our budget, and again, is conducted at the NIH Clinical Center. They do a lot of clinical work. A few examples of the work being done there: we have a women's malignancies branch, a pediatric oncology branch. Dr. Rosenberg does a lot of work in immunotherapy. He's considered, I think, one of the founders of immunotherapy and has been doing that research for quite a while. Dr. Lowy and Dr. Schiller's lab in the intramural research program really kind of set the basic science foundation for what became the HPV vaccine. So again, there's a lot more in there, but those are just a few examples of some of the work in our intramural research program. Next slide, please. So again, as I mentioned, we really focus heavily on this basic science. Roughly 50% of our budget goes towards there because we find that this is incredibly important and also something that's not really always done elsewhere. We are a government organization that, to be honest, does not need to be profitable. We don't need to focus on drug development in the way that industry and focus on profits in the way that some industry partners do. So we find a responsibility to focus on that basic science. We also do, again, everything across the spectrum. And I think that some of our work in other areas also lends itself well to this, to government work. For instance, in our clinical trials work, sometimes we do things like dose reduction studies, which again would be not of interest to industry, but really important to patients. Next slide, please. So now I can get a little bit more into the Office of Advocacy Relations. We really, our job, quite simply, is to create a culture of advocate engagement at NCI and make sure that what we refer to as the collective patient perspective is embedded throughout our research enterprise. We were founded about 25 years ago in response to the advocacy community, which at the time, I should say the cancer advocacy community, which at the time was primarily comprised of breast cancer research advocates. understandably wanting a seat at the table in terms of what research gets funded, how research is conducted, what clinical trials look like, all those sorts of things. Our office has evolved, as you can imagine, over the past 20 years, as has the advocacy community. But really, we are the front door for advocates at NCI. Next slide, please. Much of what we do can really fall under these three main categories. We communicate NCI's priorities and initiatives throughout the community. We do this in a few different ways and using a few different vehicles, including social media, webinars, and we're always looking to expand our promotion efforts. Obviously, webinars being one of them, both hosting our own and participating in ones out in the community. We facilitate engagements across NCI, meaning we refer advocates for different activities throughout the Institute to make sure that when program staff is meeting and developing a program, that advocates are at the table, have a seat at the table, and can share the patient perspective to ensure that the science is of interest to patients and really leading towards outcomes that will help patients either in the short or long term. And lastly, we collaborate with the community to figure out new opportunities and partnerships to leverage different resources or meet overlapping priorities. And really, advocates have, again, been a part of NCI's culture for many, many years, and our office's job is to continue that and maintain it. Next slide, please. So we have really kind of two unofficial sides of our office, one of which works really closely with advocacy organizations, which my colleague who's on the call, Vincent, works very closely with organizations, looking at potential partnerships, convening meetings. Often organizations come to us and want to talk to our scientific leadership to share what their research portfolios look like if they are funding research, compare it to ours and do kind of a portfolio analysis, and interacting with advocates at different meetings. They also work to place scientific leadership, NCI leadership, both scientific and administrative, at different events, when requested, if possible, throughout the community, and really monitoring issues that are important to the community and briefing NCI staff about these. Next slide, please.
Sorry, this froze. Give me 1 second.
No worries at all.
Jill, do you want to try to unshare and then reshare? And if it doesn't work, I've got it pulled up.
Yeah. Sorry, it just kicked me out of PowerPoint altogether. Allison, if you could pull it up,
I got you.
Quicker. Thank you. I just got the little spinny thing.
Terrific. Thank you so much. And in addition to advocacy organizations, we also work with individual research advocates who may be affiliated with an organization either as a volunteer, but really come often with a personal connection to cancer, either as a patient or caretaker. Community health leaders often work with us, and they are interested in getting involved in the research process. Here's a few examples you can see on this slide. We have a network of over 300 advocates that we refer across the landscape for different activities, including advisory boards, scientific steering committees, workshops, speaking engagements, task forces, really across the spectrum. And so these advocates are advocates that, in addition to their own personal experience, have what we refer to as the collective patient perspective. So they can come to the table representing a community. They have an understanding of what the priorities are in a particular research area or topic, or in a particular community. Often it's by disease type, not always. and who are interested in kind of the research process, scientific review, whether it's peer review or clinical trials concept review, that sort of thing. And in addition, really, again, have an understanding of the standard of care and a basic understanding of clinical trials. We by no means expect advocates to be experts in the science, but just kind of have a basic understanding to just kind of help, help ensure it's a positive experience for them as well as program staff. Next slide, please. So again, here's just a little bit. We work with individual research advocates as well as advocacy organization, really ranging in size and focus. Whether it's large organizations or more grassroots, smaller organizations. Often the organizations we work with fund their own research or have policy priorities, that sort of thing. Again, the advocates we work with are really interested in getting involved in that research process. Often they have, not always, but often they have participated in a training program throughout the community, whether it's NBCC's Project Lead, Fight Colorectal Cancer's RATS program. I know the International Association for the Study of Lung Cancer has a research advocacy program as well. It's by no means a requirement, but often advocates do kind of come to us after having participated in a training program externally. Next slide, please. So this is just a little bit on how we communicate with advocates. I would say the main one is, I guess this is a little dated, phone calls. Now it's more, Teams and WebEx, virtual video conferencing, but, OER, our staff is really on calls kind of all day, every day. That's really a main way. We're always out and about in the community. We're always on the phone with advocates, hearing about what their priorities are. As I mentioned, we do those referrals, and we're a referral service for the Institute, but our job really is to connect with advocates and hear the patient perspective. We do have a digest that goes out monthly, and we send out notices through our listserv. Looks like almost 1,200, between 11 and 1,200 subscribers on our listserv. We do orientation webinars for advocates that have been welcomed into our network. And we convene meetings with advocates and staff throughout the year, as well as our colleague Breeze runs our social media work on X, formerly Twitter. Next slide, please. So we are always really growing our network of advocates. When I started, I think it was just over 200 a few years ago. Now we're over 300 advocates. And again, advocates are who are interested in research advocacy reach out to us. We hold kind of an intro call to share a bit about NCI as well as OER, similar to some of what we're sharing here, and explain a little bit of the process. We welcome them into our network, and then we call upon advocates as needed. And we collaborate with our external colleagues in the National Cancer Program across government agencies to help them with advocates upon request. As you can see, last year we referred over 80 advocates for activities across the spectrum, peer review, steering committee assignments, all those sorts of things, events. The one thing I would want to note is that while we referred over 80 advocates last year, there are actually way more advocates involved throughout NCI's enterprise. That is just how many openings came up just last year. So for instance, through our Coordinating Center for Clinical Trials, which there are 35, I believe, different steering committees and task forces that review clinical trials concepts from the National Clinical Trials Network. And there are 2 advocates on each and every task force and steering committee. So in that program alone, there's roughly 70 advocates involved. Next slide, please. Here are just a few of the highlights. I won't read slide by slide, but from this past year, about how many presentations we did in the community, different community events, those sorts of things. As I mentioned, over 80 advocates were referred just last year. Next slide, please. These are just a few examples of some of the programs that advocates are involved in. We involve advocates really, again, we do research across the spectrum. So we involve advocates across the spectrum, even in some of our basic scientists. Obviously, a lot of advocates are really interested in clinical trials, and we have advocates involved in that, but we also have them involved in information technology work, cancer survivorship work, our Moonshot, some of our really large scale programs like Cancer Moonshot or the Childhood Cancer Data Initiative. We also are at times able to kind of support collaborations for advocates that are working at NCI funded sites. The Physical Science and Oncology Network is one of them. We also do convene advocates, a group of advocates in our National Clinical Trials Network. So again, just a few examples of the programs that they're involved in. Next slide, please. Just a few examples of some of the feedback and topics that we've heard from the community that we facilitated meetings on or discussed with scientific research staff and advocates as well. Things that are really at the forefront for the advocacy community. Next slide, please. I promise the next couple slides I won't read word for word. A lot of these are kind of reference slides just to show the ways in which we're out and about in the community and a few examples of the meetings we've hosted and attended. This is specifically a list of meetings that OAR supported throughout 2023. Next slide, please. These are ones where staff from OAR spoke or supported, typically either arranged to speak or spoke ourselves at these different events. Next slide, please. And, you know, again, just a few more, just an example of kind of our commitment to being really out and about in the community and getting that patient perspective any way we can. Next slide, please. So now I'm actually going to turn it over to Vincent to discuss a little bit more about our Federal Advisory Committee.
Great, thanks, John. So in addition to a lot of the engagement activities that John just shared with you, our office also has responsibility for the NCI Council of Research Advocates, or NCRA for short. NCRA is one of several federal advisory boards here at NCI and is the only one comprised exclusively of cancer research advocate leaders. The board is really charged with ensuring the collective patient perspective, as you heard John talk about before, that term, to make sure it's infused in all the activities of NCI, as well as to provide a forum for broader cancer community education and engagement on issues of importance to research. NCRI members are selected by the director of the Institute for their knowledge of research and policy, as well as their ability to represent that broad patient perspective. I should note as well that patients also serve on other NCI federal advisory boards, such as the Clinical Trials and Translational Research Committee. And again, to John's point, that there are many more advocates involved across the continuum of research at NCI than we sort of talked about today. Next slide, please. So in addition, similar to many of the other advisory boards at the Institute, NCRA typically convenes 3 times per year in a public setting. These meetings are always public through the NIH Videocast network and are available for anyone to tune in and listen into the discussions. Each meeting typically includes a regular update from the NCI director, as well as a legislative update from our colleagues in NCI's Office of Government and Congressional Relations. At recent meetings, NCRA has had discussions around topics such as opportunities to build capacity and support around innovation in clinical trials, progress toward achieving the President's Cancer Moonshot goals, emerging areas of artificial intelligence and cancer research, as well as the importance of national standards for survivorship care. And you can learn more about the NCRA by visiting our webpage, advocacy.cancer.gov. Next slide, please. So we want to take a few minutes to sort of close our presentation before we engage in discussion, just to share a few initiatives from NCI that were launched recently this year that may be of particular interest to this audience. Just a second ago, I spoke a bit about capacity building and ensuring that all stakeholders are empowered to engage in the research process. And so as we emerged from the COVID-19 pandemic, we've all really learned, especially the Institute, a lot about what it takes to build capacity where we need it most. And so just the sort of a first sort of initiative that was launched earlier this year is our Virtual Clinical Trials Office, or VCTO, that was really designed to address staff shortages that were exacerbated by the pandemic. The office is really sort of functions as a centralized team of remote support staff, including research nurses, clinical research associates, and data specialists, with the main goal of speeding accrual to trials by boosting support to teams in both community and remote settings. So this assistance really runs soup to nuts and can include screening for patients for eligibility, enrolling patients into trials, educating patients about research protocols, and helping to perform data entry. In addition, a second initiative that was launched this year is a trial designed to test a method of self-collection for cervical cancer samples, which can be done at home and sent to the laboratory for HPV testing. This trial is sort of abbreviated the SHIP trial, and really provides an independent platform to evaluate the usability, acceptability, and accuracy of multiple self-collection assays for the detection of cancer-causing types of HPV. And enrollment in the trial is expected to begin this year. And lastly, another clinical research initiative that launched in the spring this year, or rather, excuse me, in the fall of last year, was our Telehealth Research Centers of Excellence, or the TRACE initiative, which is a program supported by the Cancer Moonshot. The TRACE initiative really was, again, born out of learnings from the COVID-19 pandemic, and is focused on funding multiple centers that are focused on rapid development of an evidence base around telehealth, identifying and addressing disparities in access to telehealth services, and fostering innovations to improve cancer care delivery using new tools. And so we hope the learnings that come out of this initiative will be able to sort of inform, concurrent to activities like the virtual trials office, opportunities to speed accrual and reach underrepresented populations. Next slide, please. So with that, we want to thank you for taking the opportunity to speak with, for us to speak with you today, and share the myriad ways research advocates are able to participate in the scientific process at NCI. We're happy to take your questions, but just wanted to point out again our website here, advocacy.cancer.gov, our email inbox, nciadvocacy@nih.gov, as well as our Twitter X handle at NCI Advocacy. And so we're happy to be here again, and looking forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, John and Vincent. I would like to take the opportunity before we sort of dive into some of our questions. What questions do you all here on the webinar have about the role of advocacy in advancing cancer research? Feel free to unmute, turn your cameras on, or you can put it in the chat, and we can read that for you to our presenters as well.
Allison, hi. I have a question, Vincent and John. So what advice do you have or resources do you have for folks who may be interested in becoming a patient research advocate and may not know where to start, or how they can navigate this complex, or I should say sometimes complex, sometimes nuanced infrastructure, right? Both at the cancer center level, the community level, or even the NCI. And then if you can speak to if there's any types of trainings maybe that the NCI offers as well, would be really helpful.
Yeah, hi Garrett. Thanks so much for your question. Great question. I think it kind of, if I'm being honest, it kind of depends on what any particular advocate is interested in, what particular topic. I think if they have a particular passion about, a particular cancer type, I think looking at what organization might focus on that is a really good start. Getting involved in some of these external advocacy organizations is always a really big, I think, a great help, because that helps them kind of connect with other advocates and patients in the community. There may be opportunities to do some of those other areas like patient support that, again, while NCI doesn't, NCI works with advocates in the research advocacy space, doing some of that patient support work and some of those other opportunities really do help advocates gain that collective patient perspective to understand their communities. There are some professional societies that do offer training programs. For instance, the American Association for Cancer Research has a training program called Scientist to Survivor. That I know is one that's really of interest. And then again, some of the more cancer type specific organizations, they can often have some, I think it's really just kind of getting out there, meeting people as much as possible, and kind of to figure out exactly what sort of research advocacy or what sort of topics or sort of advocacy you may be interested in. I know sometimes a lot of advocates get their start at the Department of Defense. They actually do the CDMRP, Congressionally Directed Medical Research Program, and they call them consumer advocates, or I think are consumer reviewers. But a lot of advocates go there to kind of start their advocacy journey, or you can certainly reach out to NCI. We'd be happy to kind of share what we know and what might be a good fit at NCI. But I think really working with organizations of topics you may be interested in, as well as networking. I hear a lot from advocates. They often say that there was another advocate who really became, that they might have met at a conference or something, that really became a mentor. And I think when advocates just starting out are able to connect with another advocate and work in kind of that mentor-mentee relationship, that's really helpful in getting them connected across the landscape, if that helps.
It's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
We do have a question in the chat. The question is, as a community-based organization, how can we certify the community health workers to do coordination in something like research or advocacy?
I'm so sorry. Can you repeat? My audio cut out for just a quick second there. My apologies.
That's okay. As a community-based organization, how can we certify or involve community health workers to do this type of research or
Yeah, I mean, great question. So, I can kind of speak from the perspective of NCI. I think reaching out to our office and sharing your perspective, we have often worked with community health leaders in different capacities, and we are always happy to connect to learn more about what issues you guys are facing, what issues the patients you guys serve are facing, that sort of thing. We sometimes have a general sense. Other times it can be quite different from what we've heard, and these issues are always evolving. That's kind of from the NCI standpoint. I know that hearing how community health leaders work, elsewhere is really doing a lot of that education and outreach, working a lot with the community oncology practices who might do some research work. Our office typically doesn't ask advocates to do any sort of recruitment for clinical trials, but I do hear that is a way that advocates are involved kind of external to NCI. So I don't know if I hope that's helpful in kind of providing a bit of context around kind of how we work with community health leaders, as well as how they might be involved elsewhere throughout the community. And some of those I'm guessing you're very aware of.
Yeah, John, if I could just chime in too, to just sort of piggyback on your response to the last question as well. We are aware of many, different types of training and certification programs that are out in the community, but just to put a finer point on it, that's not something that a resource that NCI itself offers.
I was the one to do that question, and sorry, it's Gabby Portugal, and I'm from Alliance Community Services. We work with a network of community health workers, and some of them have already gone through CT training, HIPAA, ICH, GCPs, etc. But it's very important for us how to get involved, not only in the implementation process, but also all the way from scratch when the protocol is being written, and planning about how this is going to be in a real world be implemented. It's very, very important for us to have the opinion of the community health workers as well as the leaders. And this is something that we find very interesting for a community-based organization, because we already have the outreach part of it, and the hospital has the clinical part of it. So building that bridge from our standpoint could be very easy if we get the community health workers being that liaison between the clinical setting and the community. So I want to just say how amazing this could be.
Yeah, and I think there are certain programs that NCI runs that are really, I'm sure you're probably most likely familiar with our community oncology research program, and I think potentially linking up with PIs that are submitting protocols there, early. We always advise program staff to involve advocates early and often. I think we're seeing, in addition to NCI, this really increased appetite for, extramural PIs to work with advocates to, early and often to build those protocols to make sure that they have that patient voice involved and are really optimize the chances for success throughout. So I think connecting with as many, NCORE PIs that might be, one possibility that could be really helpful. But, happy to talk afterwards as well if you want to brainstorm ideas.
Sure, will. Yes, because I was just thinking like, okay, I don't want to get them like all the way through the ACRP or something like that heavy. And at some point kind of like over from what we need. But this is, I think, a very interesting moment to be in clinical research. So thank you.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
Other audience questions? We do have a couple questions. Carla, feel free to jump in as well if you have any points you want to add before your presentation begins. And those of you in the audience, feel free to chat in if you think of another question as we're going. But Vincent, John, Carla, I'm wondering, how can local communities get involved in cancer research advocacy?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think some of the things that I mentioned before, I think that, local communities, again, we are a national organization, but hearing from local communities is really important for us as well, because we understand that that is where so many patients receive their care and is such an important part of patient care. So, feel free to reach out to our office. I think getting involved at a local cancer center, a local oncology community oncology program that might do research, I think can be really helpful. Again, getting involved in some of these patient support organizations, or particularly if they do have a research advocacy arm or research program of themselves. Often they actually, if an advocacy organization is funding research, they often do have their advocates review some of the grant applications that come in, that sort of thing. And so those are just a few ways that advocates can get involved and either kind of stay involved in the local community, or, in addition to the local community, kind of have as kind of a stepping stone to doing some work on the more national and state levels.
Great, thank you. I think that emphasis is really helpful. I think we work with a lot of community-based coalitions, community-based, cancer advocates. And so I think that perspective is helpful. Thank you. What strategies have you found effective in building a strong network of advocates?
Yeah, so, from NCI standpoint, we really are out and about in the community, and we are often we have a network of over 300 advocates, but we are always growing our network, because I think that while we do have advocates involved in a lot of these programs across the Institute, which is terrific, a lot of those engagements do have term limits, and we feel that that's important so that we can get fresh perspectives, every couple of years, advocates with new ideas, with different perspectives than what might have been before. So we are always growing our advocates. I probably sound a bit like a broken record, but leaning on advocacy training programs is really helpful for us. Doing as many presentations we can out and about in the community, trying to be out and about at different conferences and workshops. We were able to facilitate Dr. Kimron Rathnell, the NCI director, to speak at the Patient Advocate Lounge at the ASCO annual meeting this year, which I think was really helpful for us in getting a chance to meet a few advocates. But really being out and about in the community and working so closely with the different advocacy organizations, and just looking at our network, time and time again to see, where are the gaps, talking to advocates about, what are they hearing are the big, topics bubbling up in the advocacy community, and who are kind of the thought leaders from an advocacy standpoint in those areas.
Great, thank you very much. And our other presenters, feel free to chime in at any time.
I think I can share on a local level. Our research advocacy group, this is Carla, Lloyd, who chairs the Huntsman Breast and Gynecologic Cancer Research Advocate. I think for continuing to engage our 15 advocates, here at Huntsman. It's a matter of working on continued projects of value so that they engage with researchers, work on projects that allow them to give back. After they have gone through their cancer treatment or they're in treatment while they're an advocate in our group, they have often told us that giving back to the research community is very important to them.
I love that. Thank you so much for adding that, Carla. Okay, so the next question for our presenters is, can you share a specific example of how maybe grassroots advocacy has made a difference in cancer research? I think sometimes, you know, we hear about these programs and it's hard to visualize what that actually looks like. And so I think any specific community-based and grassroots examples would be helpful.
And I can just start and say that, you know, again, from our perspective, you know, NCI and our activities, you know, out in the community are focused on education and awareness around cancer research. I think, you know, when we hear the term grassroots advocacy, you know, we think of, John alluded this actually a little earlier. We think about sort of different kinds of advocacy, right? So there's local advocacy getting involved there and sort of bubbling up. There's also research advocacy, which we spent all of our time, you know, talking about today. And then when we think about grassroots advocacy, we typically think of advocacy that's more directed towards sort of the legislative branch or the congressional appropriations process. And so, you know, as you may know, NCI's budget is decided each fiscal year by Congress. So there are certainly, you know, individuals that are interested in getting involved in that way and sort of sharing their story and, you know, speaking about the research process in that way. And that's certainly, you know, an excellent way to sort of get involved. But, you know, having said that, I think early in our presentation, we had a slide outlining some of the ways that advocates have sort of, or case studies, if you will, have sort of been able to provide their unique perspective and to advance the science. You know, I think one in particular is just activity around the various cancer moonshot research initiatives. I think, you know, sort of we're in the second sort of iteration of the cancer moonshot now under President Biden. But what was really the impetus behind a lot of that was a blue ribbon panel that started under then Vice President Biden, and that also included representation of advocates from the community. And so I would say that that's sort of really sort of a more long-term sort of concrete example of how this type of advocacy has really helped, you know, start at the bottom at the ground level and sort of has now helped carry forward a lot of the activity that we still see today. Yeah, so that's sort of in a nutshell. I think that's the best example I can provide. I think since we're sort of living it right now with a lot of the moonshot activity. But, you know, I think, you know, just more broadly, I think, you know, advocates really do provide, just to put a finer point on this, advocates really do provide a unique perspective and expertise in other ways as well. You know, John spoke a little bit about how patients can help identify barriers to joining a clinical trial with respect to underserved populations, also providing feedback from the community and how to join a particular clinical trial, how to sort of get involved in that way, as well as ensuring proposed science has outcomes that benefit patients over both the short and long term. So those are some other ways I think that are really essential now that we've sort of emerged from, the pandemic. We've all sort of identified at all of our own organizations sort of how to be a bit more efficient, how to sort of reach people a bit easier and get them sort of looped in and participate in the research process. So
thank you. That was a great example. And for those of you that weren't able to join us for our special webinar last week with the Biden Moonshot program, we will also be sending out a recording to that. And so I think these two topics really dovetail nicely. And if you haven't listened, please do. Rachel, you have a question.
Hi, this is Rachel Sabalos. I'm the Senior Director for Community Outreach and Engagement at Huntsman Cancer Institute. Thank you all for joining. I have a great example, actually. You know, we can have advocates at the national level, but one of the best examples I know of was by my mentor, Dr. Betty Thompson, who's now emeritus at University of Washington. She had a community advisory board that was very active in her research. It was behavioral research, but that's also considered clinical by the definition of the National Institute of Health. And she was doing work in pesticides and pesticide exposure in Latino farm workers. And one of the studies that they were funded to do was to get samples of measures of pesticide exposure, both in the fields and in the homes of farm workers. And it was a community member who said, well, most of the dust that, I pick up in the field ends up in my car. So why don't you vacuum our cars to get samples and measure that? And that was a critical piece that a community member added to the research. That work actually showed what is now referred to as the take-home pathway of pesticide exposure, and supported policy change at the national level as well as local level, and changed the way people think about the pesticide research that's done in the fields. It linked to exposure of pesticides in children of farm workers in the home who play on the floors and everything, and showing that pathway was really a critical piece. So having community members advise research is a fantastic example of how you can actually impact policy by being on the ground.
Thank you, Rachel. That's such a great example.
Sure.
What do you see as the future of cancer research advocacy? And this can be you as an organization, you personally, kind of what do you envision that looking like?
Yeah, I mean, I think we, personally, again, yeah, I think I can see it continuing to grow quite exponentially. I think so. When I was first came to NCI, there were quite a few areas where advocates were involved here. That has grown, and I think more so even the way that advocates are engaged throughout the community has grown quite a bit. We often hear from advocacy organizations or professional organizations and societies reaching out to us saying, hey, we know you guys have had advocates involved, for 10, 15 plus years now. What are the best ways? What have you guys found to work? What would you guys advise us to, do, considering this is what our program looks like? Different, kind of outside of the oncology landscape, different ICs throughout NIH have often reached out to us and said, hey, very similar, how do we do this? So we see it really continuing to grow. And I think that, advocates fought so hard, 2.5 decades ago to get a seat at the table. And I think, over my time here, I've really seen program staff and PIs really see advocates as research partners who can really contribute in important and meaningful ways that advance cancer research. And I think PIs are beginning to really see them as essential partners in this work.
Thank you very much, John. Anything else our other presenters would add in terms of the future of cancer research advocacy and what that might look like as it grows? Okay.
Again, this is Rachel, sorry.
Yes, go ahead, please.
I think for us, I don't know, Carla, if you talked about your group specifically and what you've done with the breast and gyne research group, but we're also looking at trying to get a similar patient advocate research group going with the other disease centers here at HCI. And I think that that's one of our major next steps here locally, is to train people in research. And I've spoken with Vincent and John on their recommendations for what kinds of training. And we, of course, want to follow a lot of what Carla's done. She's done a fantastic job of setting up a group here that is engaged in not only our behavioral research and clinic-based research, but to have conversations with the bench scientists as well. And I've heard things about how individuals in the bench science have engaged with community members, and it's made them think about their science differently, and recalling, why they're doing the work, if nothing else. So I think that there's a lot of room for growth here, and that we are on a great path to move forward.
Thanks so much, Rachel. I am gonna transition the time to Dr. Carla Lloyd. Carla is the chair and co-founder of HCI's Breast and Gynecologic Cancer Research Advocate Committee. She's also a Komen advocate in science and serves as a patient advocate on the Utah Cancer Registry. She's a professor emerita from Syracuse University's Newhouse School of Communications, where she taught for 32 years, serving as its inaugural Associate Dean of Scholarly and Creative Activity, advertising the department chair and milestone director. So Carla, the time is yours. Just give me a second to reshare my screen. Hi, Carla, are you able to hear us? Dr. Lloyd?
I am so
There we
sorry.
go. No,
I was
you're great.
on mute. I'd like to thank Rachel for this opportunity to speak here today. And I have been asked by webinar organizers to share my research advocacy experience at the Huntsman Cancer Institute with you today. And that will be starting with my personal background and professional experience. Next slide. I am a stage 3 HER2 positive 12-year breast cancer survivor. Before I had cancer, as my bio pointed out, I was a professor, associate dean, department chair, and director at Syracuse University's S.I. Newhouse School of Public Communications. As with so many cancer patients, my life perspective changed after cancer. So I retired 3 years following my extensive treatment. I am now a professor emeritus. Next slide, please. Thanks to my incredible team of doctors at Upstate Medical Cancer Center in Syracuse, New York, I survived cancer and lived to be a grandmother. Here I am at my grandson's first birthday just 2 weeks ago. Next slide, please. I am a research advocate to give back to my amazing team of doctors who saw me through this disease. Doctors Lemke, Shapiro, Shu, and Curtis, plus their skilled and compassionate staff. Next slide. There was no outlet for research advocacy when I landed in Salt Lake City, nor did I really know what research advocacy was. So I worked with Dr. Alana Wilm to create one. As a matter of fact, my project lead project proposal was to start a research advocacy committee under the direction of Alana at Huntsman, and we did. Our work began 8 years ago. Dr. Wilm had wanted to start a breast cancer research advocacy committee, as you can see from her quote here on this slide. Next slide, please. Alana and I worked together to create the first research advocacy group at HCI. In all ways, it continues to be a great experience working with Dr. Wilm. Next slide. Now, I am going to really abbreviate this because this was a lot of work, but this is condensed in terms of how our advocacy committee here at Huntsman came about. I conducted 2 years of extensive research and strategic development. I conducted extensive secondary and primary research, specifically with in-depth interviewing with primary research. That then was followed by strategic planning and then pilot testing and advocacy program to support breast cancer researchers. This was all under the direction of Dr. Alana Whelm. Next slide. What came out of all this work was our Research Advocate Committee. It was first the Women's Cancer Research Advocate Committee, but the Cancer Center has now been renamed the Breast and Gynecologic Cancer Center. So our group is a volunteer team of 15 patients and survivors who have confronted breast, ovarian, endometrial, and/or cervical cancers. Our members serve as research-specific advocates and support the Breast and Gyn Cancer Center here at HCI. When needed and requested, these research advocates provide patient perspectives on the different phases of researchers' projects to ensure that the design and execution of research goals and projects include patients' viewpoints and lived experiences. Next slide, please. So here is an overview of the work we do. I will not get into the specifics. This is just broad strokes. We collaborate with the Breast and Gyn Cancer Center researchers as, for example, they pursue grants, pilot studies, clinical trials, awards, and other research endeavors. We also initiate and conduct our own studies for the center and HCI. We assist in fundraising and community outreach to raise funds for research in the center and HCI. And through these efforts, the Breast and Gyn Cancer Research Advocates are dedicated to contributing to the advancement of care, treatment, and outcomes of breast and gynecologic cancer patients. Next slide. I would like to share with you some highlights of our advocate committee's achievements. We initiated a trainee-focused annual symposium to teach science communication and the value of working with advocates. It's called the Project Next Symposium. It teaches the next generation of new young researchers the value of research advocacy. According to Dr. Whelm, this is the first symposium developed and hosted by advocates in the United States. We have written also in our past 7 years, 20 letters of support for grants. We have a 71% success rate in those letters, helping to the grants to receive funding. We are in the midst of our 21st letter right now. We conducted and wrote an original research report to increase patient participation in clinical trials at HCI, which was very well received by leaders. We developed and implemented a comprehensive advocate recruitment plan. At the beginning of our committee, we found that recruiting patients to a research advocate committee was difficult, and this plan put us on the right path. We have initiated community outreach projects with our Fence of Hope exhibit, our Komen More Than Pink Walk Recruitathon, and we are right now engaged with the Thank You Breast and Gyn Cancer Center Researcher campaign. We have participated in HCI and the center's fundraisers. Next slide, please. And we created and launched and secured funding for 2 scientific liaison awards for breast cancer trainees. They help us at our monthly meetings, as well as Dr. Whelm. We assisted in the development and implementation of a strategic plan for a Huntsman-wide, system-wide advocate committee, which Rachel just mentioned. And we launched the Better Together Advocate poster exhibit, where each advocate explained what they value most in working with HCI researchers. This exhibit was displayed at this year's Project Next symposium. Next slide, please. Now I'd like to, next slide. I'd like to conclude my presentation with 2 examples of HCI advocate researcher collaborations. Next slide. And we'll start with working with Dr. Jay Gertz. Dr. Gertz is a Cancer Center research program leader. He came to us with an application for an award from the DoD Breast Cancer Research Program to study breast and uterine cancer mutations and identify promising therapies for patients with ER mutations. After an interactive presentation to understand his research and details of how we could contribute, the committee wrote a letter of support for him to include in his grant application. And this is what he told us afterwards about collaborating with our committee. I really enjoyed working with the advocates. They were very engaged during my research presentation and asked insightful questions, several of which I hadn't considered. The perspective that the advocates shared was incredibly helpful in writing a late abstract that appealed to breast cancer research advocates on the grant review panel. The final letter of support from the advocates was absolutely terrific, mixing key facts with personal perspectives, and was a strength of my application. Our second collaboration is on the next slide. Here is where we worked with Dr. Mary Pladen. She's a nutritional and career epidemiologist and trained as a dietitian. Her project focused on early prolonged overnight fasting and metabolic health in endometrial cancer surgery and survivorship. Here was our collaboration overview. After learning about the research project, advocates asked many questions about the pilot trial that compared time-restricted feeding to a control diet among endometrial cancer patients. Advocates brought up and discussed potential challenges of wearing the tracking devices that Dr. Pladen was recommending for participants to wear. And we pointed out alternative ways to ensure compliance with meal programs and tracking. What Mary Pladen had to say about working with us as follows. Thank you very much for allowing us to present. We got so much great feedback and many things I did not consider that are very important. So I think it was a very successful meeting. We will definitely keep you updated on our progress. Next slide. So again, thank you, webinar organizers, for this opportunity to explain our breast and gyne cancer research advocate group today. If you have any questions, I would be happy to answer them now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lloyd. What questions do you all have? Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and go through our closing slides, but feel free to chat in any questions for any of our presenters. Oh, Garrett, did you have a question?
Yes, sorry. Carla, thank you. So informative and amazing work. Can you speak to how you've recruited the additional members of the advocacy group that we see here on the screen?
Yes, thank you, Garrett, for that question. We tried different methods, having big posters at the Coleman More Than Pink Walk, inviting participants, for example, to ask us about becoming a research advocate. That didn't work. What eventually worked is us working with the clinicians and having a one-page description of what research advocacy is. I think when left up to patients, if you don't define what the research advocacy is, they'll think about political advocacy or patient advocacy, where they're working one-on-one with patients. So we developed a one-page, easy to understand handout, and we gave them to Huntsman clinicians. And when the clinicians would be in their patient visits and they saw a patient that looked like they would be interested in doing the type of work we do in our committee, they would hand out one of these flyers. And that has really worked for us. We also recruit within our group. One of the things that we have worked very hard to achieve is to have representation of all the different breast cancer types. And so we just landed our first lobular cancer breast cancer patient. And we are also working on diversity in our committee. We now have 2 Latinas on our committee as well.
Thank you so much, Garrett, for that question, and Dr. Lloyd for helping us understand better how these participants were recruited. Other questions from our audience?
Well, Garrett and Carla, I'm wondering if you have any insights on how, if someone were interested or knew people who are interested, they may start the process of being involved with our disease centers or other researchers. We're interested in having representation from across the 5 states. So, I think just who they should reach out to or what it might involve as much as you can. I realize this is in development, but that may be an interesting point.
Yeah, I'll just briefly mention, because I know we have folks from the region here. It's been touched on a couple of times, but really thinking about how we can leverage what we've learned specifically for the breast and gynecologic work that Carla has led, and really expand that to all 9 disease centers within the cancer center, and thinking about how we can have an overarching group. So because, as you can imagine, some disease centers their prognosis of some of their patients for neuro or for other types of tumors, it's been more difficult to recruit, to retain, other thing, depending on the cancer type and the cancer prognosis. So that being said, we're really interested in, piloting this fall and thinking about what the recruitment may look like for patient advocates from all disease types. So if anybody's interested, they can reach out to our community outreach and engagement team, and really think about, if you work in a health system, if there's patients that that we could tap into. We're going to utilize Carla's amazing method of trying to recruit other patients within our own hospital and clinics, as you can imagine. And then I think we'll have that one pager, which she spoke of, which has more detailed information that can kind of be sent out. So with that, Dr. Portugal, please.
Yes, thank you. Well, right now we are doing an open screening for community members for early detection of fatty liver, which is prevention for liver cancer. And we are having a lot of people who are positive and they need some navigation to additional either studies or just educational programs. I was wondering if there's like a liaison for research projects at the Huntsman Institute that we can use to get that option to the clinical research studies to open for them. Sometimes people is very positive about participating in a clinical research study, but they don't know how to look for it. So we are in a very interesting spot here because we are doing the outreach, we are pre-screening the patients. So those who have fatty liver or even fibrosis, there's many studies opening for the GLP agonists. And I would like to know, how do we build the advocates and the clinical researchers to acknowledge this kind of like contacts, you know? I don't know if it's clear.
Yeah, go ahead, Rachel.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cough there. I was thinking of, some of the clinical trial education that we're doing in general. And that's all being revised, and we're going to be getting that out into the community soon. So that's a possibility as one route for people to learn about research in general and why we do it and why it's important and how they can get involved. But if others have other ideas, please feel free to share.
Go ahead, Phyllis.
So I think it's worth mentioning that there are several avenues because I became involved in research as an advocate. Oh gosh, Donna Branson was actually the one who suggested that I start participating on a board with Komen when they were setting up different advocacy boards for different minority groups. And Komen provides training in its Advocates for Science. It also provides training when you sit on their different boards. They offer training at some of their breast conferences for anyone who wants to go to begin. The Association for the American Association for Cancer Researchers, AACR, has a scientist to survivor program, which trains. It's a 2-year program where you go through the mechanisms of what research is and how it applies to cancer. And once you finish that program, which Nathan, I referred him to that program. He's gone through it. And once you finish, you also become a mentor. And so you become very familiar with what it means to participate in all different cancer sites and different kinds of research. And then as patient advocates, there is a group with the Alliance. And we start out as patient advocates. Most of us do have a research background because we've gone through different programs that trained us to understand what clinical trials are. One is CISNA, Cancer Information SN something network. It's CISN. If you Google that, there is training modules available there. Komen has training modules that are available. And in the Alliance, what we do is we sit on the Patient Advocate Committee. I sit on Pharmacogenomics and the Health Disparities Committee. And we help develop clinical trials. And so our research experience, it extends from this one suggestion from Donna Branson to that, to where I am now 23 years later, sitting on national boards and national advocacy groups and national research groups. So this availability, all you really have to do is Google research advocacy training programs, and they're going to come up. At the Huntsman, one of the things that we went through, and I encouraged Nathan to do as well, was take the training program on clinical trials. And it was a learning module that helped introduce the American Indian program 22 years ago to clinical trials as they exist here at the Huntsman Cancer Institute. And I essentially started with no background really in cancer research. I was a geologist at one point, and my research was in rocks. The only fortunate thing was that under a spectrum microscope, cancer cells and rock crystallizations, they look similar, very similar. But if anyone is interested, that's how you can get started. I was also part of what the National Cancer Institute had at one time. I don't know if you still have Carla, John. There was the CAR program, and then there was the DCLG. That was a long time ago, where we actually were advocates who would work with the cancer director. I think that's what the research advocacy program is now. But there's a lot of avenues, and it takes time. It takes one just jumping in the deep end, and you're really blessed to have Google now, because you can look things up. NCI does have great websites to look up different things, and it's really worthwhile. It really makes a difference in how we work with patients, how we work with communities, how we work with investigators. And as you've been listening to different advocates speak now, research advocates speak now, make a real difference in the research with the voice of the advocate and the voice of the patient, as PCORI grants, often hold. And you can advance from there to becoming a reviewer on grant applications. And I really recommend Komen for that, because I started out as just a representative on a minority advocacy group, to going through their training and then reviewing their grants. They put me on that platform.
Thank you so much, Phyllis, for that perspective. I think it's helpful to have those examples. Just for sake of time, I'm going to close with sort of a save the date for our next webinar. We are going to be hosting our next webinar on November 21st. Same time as this. Agenda and registration will be coming soon. If you're not already, this is another plug for our newsletter. If you're not already a part of our Mountain West Cancer Collaborative newsletter, please do so here. This is how you will receive updates on our upcoming webinars as well. So take a second to pull out your phone cameras and scan that QR code. We will also send this with the follow-up email. So if you miss it, we will send it in our follow-up email. Lastly, I really would love you all to take this webinar evaluation. This is how we can help improve webinars in the future, and really how we can evaluate the effectiveness of this format. So please, again, open up your camera, take a second to open this webinar evaluation. It takes maybe 3 minutes, probably less. This would be super helpful to us. If you do it now, then you don't have to think about it again. And we will send a link to this survey in a follow-up email as well. But just want to say thank you again to all of our presenters, John, Vincent, Dr. Lloyd. You all were fabulous. I learned so much. I'm sure others did as well. We will be sharing the presenter slides and contact information in our follow-up email. So thank you all for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.